This next video is going to be about our next project, or actually our first project, um, and it is going to center around the idea of light and value. So the one of the this is a topic that you've obviously thought a lot about in your intro to drawing class, mostly about how you can create the illusion of light through value. This semester, we're going to be thinking more about the symbols and metaphors that are created through um, the use of light and value. So you're not just thinking about how your drawing will look, but what your drawing will say. And we're going to use value as a tool, a creative tool for expression. Another thing that we're going to look at is some of the ways that you can create value and use concepts through value creation. So one example we'll think about is, light versus dark, and what are some of the dual meanings you can use through the use of that. Perhaps shadow is another symbolic subject matter or metaphor that you could use. We'll also think about the cultural associations when we talk about lightness or darkness. And the last thing we're going to think about is expressive use of value. So we're going to kind of look and think about, we're going to see some artist examples who may use value in this way. And it's just going to get you thinking. This week, you're going to have to turn in your thumbnail sketches. So really researching and thinking about what you want to do with this first drawing. And then your final project you'll be turning in is a complete, well thought out piece that uses value to express some meaning or concept. So as you're working, we're going to think about some of these big questions. What is light? And you can think about it in a scientific way, right? There are beams coming from the sun. But if we're also going to think about what could be some meanings of light. When we look at examples through art history or contemporary examples, you'll see there's many different meanings that artists think about when they're thinking about the concept of light, right? What is darkness? If we think about it in scientific terms, it's the absence of light, right? When we don't have those waves coming down from the sun. But symbolically, there can be a whole nother meaning, right? It can be about the absence of something. What are some metaphors of light and darkness? And so these first couple examples, we're gonna think about some historical uses of some metaphors of light and dark. And I want you guys to think about what are some metaphors for light and dark that you might come up with. So this first example is probably one of the first ideas that might pop into your head when we think about light and dark. A very common use of it is goodness versus evil, right? Light is the good, darkness is the bad, and this is something we have historically seen a lot of. This is a piece by Albrecht Dürer from the Northern Renaissance. And you can see here is depicted the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They are actually depicted as the good, even though they seem pretty murderous as you look at the picture. But they are there tromping out the evil in the earth. So they are literally the light coming down from heaven to stamp out sin. Now, could you have a different meaning of that without the biblical background? Sure, that there's definitely a darker, more evil tone when you sort of look at the poor people being trampled there on earth. It doesn't quite have that clear of one is good and one is bad, right? Another way that lightness and darkness can be used is in a dramatic sense. You see this used a lot in movies, right? Where if you're trying to create some tension or some drama, a very strong light up against a very dark creates that sense of tension, or you could even think about fear or the unknown. And it's a technique that's often used in film, as you can see from this example from A Streetcar Named Desire. The light is sort of there to try to help gain knowledge or an understanding between the two characters, right? It's almost a character in itself, that light bulb coming down to kind of bring that light and that drama to the scene. Another example that you are going to look at in actually the discussion post this week is the allegory of Plato's cave. Some of you may have read or heard about this from maybe your literature class, or maybe you've just watched the movie The Matrix, because that is like the contemporary allegory that essentially came from the same Plato's cave allegory. But the allegory, and you'll see when you watch the video in the discussion post, is really an allegory about light. And I won't give away too much right now, but he was thinking as a tool, like as light as enlightenment, and the darkness is kind of ignorance. So you'll see what Plato talks about the and some of the interactions. You can think about. I want you to think about how you could put that into a contemporary sense, right? Like if you still feel like this allegory has some kind of truth today. So that, like I said, I won't go into it too much now, but you're going to have a discussion post about that. And, Plato, as you'll see, one of the big metaphors he thinks about is shadow, and how shadow can hide things or alter perceptions. And that's something a lot of artists are interested in. And you can see that in many examples. This one by a Japanese artist in the 19th century. You can see the shadow behind the warrior there. While it's his own shadow, it is his own enemy, right? And you can kind of think about that as a metaphor for us fighting our own demons, right? Sometimes we are our own worst enemy. Artists even sometimes use literal shadows as parts of their artwork. And I have a few just because I really love these. Obviously, it's not a painting or a drawing, which is mostly what we're looking at. But in a sense, it is a 2D flat work of art, right? It's just, is the work of art actually the welded together forks and knives, or is it the motorcycle that you see on the ground? Is it the piece of plexiglass, or is it the figures underneath? The shadow almost takes on a more realistic essence than the object itself. So What is the truth, right? Is what a lot of these artists are thinking of. Is the truth the object in itself, or is it the thing that is revealed through the shadows? So, in some ways, this is almost an opposite take on the Plato's metaphor, where the shadows represent false things or lack of knowledge, where they're actually having a different meaning to the shadow. So that's something you could think about in your piece. Do you want the shadow? What does the shadow represent to you? Is it the truth, or is it a lie, right? And one more, because I think this one is more kind of humorous. It's a pile of essentially 6 months worth of the artist's trash. So it's just this big pile of disgusting trash. And then you see in the shadow, it's actually a self-portrait of the two artists who created the piece. They're sort of living a frivolous lifestyle. So there's some humor to it, but it also speaks a lot about our culture and our willingness to just create mounds of garbage to live the lifestyle that we live, right? So in some ways, the shadow is kind of presenting some of the truth, right? Okay, so another thing that we're going to think about is, the expressive use of value. So how value can represent a mood or emotion. And so we're also going to think about, sometimes there's a technique called value reversal, where you're thinking about, we always think about dark representing the shadow, white representing the figures, but you can also play with what you allow the dark values to represent and what you allow the light values to represent, which is something that you can think about in value reversal. It can help to underscore your concept. It can make you shift or think about things in a different way. An artist who really loved to play with value reversal is MC Escher. You see this a lot in his drawings. This is sort of his famous example of the positive and negative space reversal, where at the top, the dark value is the positive shape, and as you move down, it becomes slowly those negative shapes become the positive shapes, and the lighter values actually become the object. And he's really toying with composition and playing on your senses a little bit. And, this one doesn't have a huge, deeper meaning in it, but he does toy around with that in many of his other pieces, where in the darkness it becomes something else. This is another well-known MC Escher piece, where as you look into the darkness of the eye, you actually see a skull emerge in that dark value. So you can think about, that's almost inner thoughts, right? You can kind of see those inner demons that person might be thinking about. This is another great MC Escher piece that really toys around with line and value. And you can see he's using value to create form, right? And it's really kind of a question. He's thinking about sort of the idea of infinity, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Are we constructing our reality, or is the world around us constructing it? It's through this one simple form, it's expressing really a universal question, like one of those kind of where's the beginning at questions that many philosophers think about over time. So, and it's, through just some things being fully fleshed out with values and other things being simply represented through line. And that's something that you could toy with in your drawing. So another way that we're going to think about value is value as a concept, or really thinking about contemporary issues in society and what value can represent. And one artist who really deals with that a lot in her work is Kara Walker. Um, Actually, if any of you um, are interested in Kara Walker, if you've seen her work before, there's an exhibition that actually just opened on last Saturday at the Berkeley Museum of Art that has some very interesting work of hers, along with a lot of other contemporary feminist artists, if you're interested to check it out. But Kara Walker's work she's one of the more controversial contemporary artists in the way in which she uses shadow to talk about race and some of the racial trauma that has happened in our country's past. A lot of the works are very disturbing, and they're not disturbing because they're necessarily explicit, but that as you look closer and closer to the imagery, you start to see very disturbing things. And some of the things that make Kara Walker's work so disturbing is that some of it's in your imagination. It doesn't show it because it's a silhouette. You don't fully see what's happening, and you sort of have to make up the in-betweens. And this is actually, it's not going to be in our discussion post this week, but you'll see some more of Kara Walker talking about her work she was in one of the Art 21 series on PBS. And she talks about the idea of the way she's representing the figures through silhouettes, and how actually the art of creating silhouettes has some historical meaning in the South, and was sort of a common way that sort of the everyday person could get their portrait drawn. There were people who went around and did that, and so it's representative of the time, but it's also meant to talk about some things that are still going on in our culture and how she feels that we haven't fully dealt with it yet. So we'll look at that a little bit more next week. Another artist that deals with similar issues to Kara Walker is Amy Sherald, and her work deals a lot with race and how race is perceived. She has these very colorful backgrounds, very colorful clothing, but the figure is completely done in monochrome. So often they're either drawn in graphite, or also just done in acrylic paint. This one's done fully in graphite, so it's a full value graphite drawn, while the remainder of the painting is done in acrylic. And you maybe have heard of Amy Sherald before. She is the artist that was chosen to do Michelle Obama's portrait for the National Portrait Gallery. And there was some original controversy around Michelle Obama's portrait, specifically because of how the skin tone was dealt with. And when you look, this is actually from when the portrait was revealed. I mean, you look at the picture and it's beautifully painted, but when you look at it compared to Michelle Obama, a lot of people said it didn't look like her, specifically because of the way the skin tone was represented, while the rest of, her dress and background were so colorful. And that's actually a part of her, the conceptual meaning that she's trying to express. Her statement describes her approach to portraiture by saying, "My work began as an exploration to exclude the idea of color as race from my paintings, by removing color but still portraying racialized bodies as objects to be viewed through portraiture." So, oftentimes race is described by the color of people's skins, but she's trying to talk about how race is actually more than that, right? That she's trying to talk about, um, you know, she's creating a narrative, um, and thinking about how um, race is depicted historically, right? And she goes on to say these paintings originated as a creation of a fairy tale, illustrating an alternate existence in response to a dominant narrative of Black history. My idea became more legible. As my ideas became more legible, the use of fantasy evolved into the scenes of spectacle. So that's one of the reasons why she wants to use very bright colors, right? And they're beautiful paintings. And it's interesting because, oftentimes the figure, especially when I look at these two next to each other, they're almost overwhelmed by the color of the background and the cover and the color of their clothing. Those seem to have a presence and a story of their own. So she's interested in, you know, that how color sort of changes our perception. Kerry James Marshall is another artist who's interested in using value, and talking about, contemporary depictions of African Americans. And he goes into the extremes when we talk about like value representations. His value range stays sort of in the very dark, or the extreme light. So you can even see in this figure how the shadow range skews towards to that mid to dark range, and then you see those very extreme highlights. So they're very dramatic, right? And I just want to read from his artist statement as well. He, from this specific series of work, he noted that in contrast to the images that present African American men as somewhat threatening, somehow violent, somehow irresponsible, somehow nihilistic and alienated, he wanted to show representations of African Americans that can be incredibly mundane, so that they can be very ordinary and don't have to be event-filled or anxiety-laden or about political activism. It can just be a picture, period. So he really wanted to make just boring images about everyday life. And that's something that Kerry James Marshall often talks about, that there's sort of a heavy weight that he feels as an African American, that his work has to be about something else. That if you're a European white artist, that you can touch on any subject matter that you want, but he has to feel like his is always brought into race somehow. So, and he's actually making work about that feeling, right? And they're beautiful drawings, right? The bottom in itself is this beautiful line drawn, and the only part that's fleshed out in full value is the skin. And you can see that again in another one of his images here. They're beautifully drawn, but he uses that value range specifically to draw attention to the figure's skin. It's sort of like a play on contrast. So project requirements, you can, it has to have full value involved, right? Because we're thinking about it being a project based on value. Color is allowed but not required. If you want to use a little bit of color, that's totally okay. You can use any subject matter you like. It could be something totally mundane in that you're saying something through your use of value. It could be something epic, like a battle of light and dark, and you're using value to help illustrate that. It could be just a portrait that you are portraying emotion through in your use of value. So it's open-ended, but I realize that can be more difficult sometimes. That's why you have this whole week to really think about and come up with your subject matter. We're thinking about the use of value to create expressive content or conceptual content. You can exaggerate or change the value. You don't have to draw whatever you're drawing exactly the way the value is. You're going to think about changing it so that you can say something about your concept. You can also think about value as a conceptual tool to draw attention, or a compositional tool, so you can draw attention to one area or take the attention away from another area. You can use any material you like. You could use graphite or charcoal. I don't have a size specified for this project, and it is going to be specific to your idea and the material that you're using. So most of you should know from Intro to Drawing that graphite you're going to use a smaller page for, because of your ability to draw little tiny small details easier, but it's harder to cover large areas of value. If you're using charcoal, that's a little easier to go big and do kind of big exciting things, but it's actually a little harder to get small tiny details. So it kind of depends on, size, depends on your project idea and which material you're going to use. Like I said, this week is about coming up with your idea, and you're going to make 3 thumbnail sketches that you're actually going to turn in an assignment post this week. So hopefully some of the discussion posts and this PowerPoint will help get you thinking about what you want to do.